Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the penultimate episode in my series of videos for our read-along of Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. If you are unaware, over the last 18 months I have been hosting a Victorian-style serialised read-along of Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend and making videos every month. This video today is the video on October's chapters. I'm sorry it's like a whole month late. Life got ahead of me, especially I think because October was Victober, and so I was trying to get a lot read for that. I ended up not reading October's chapters in October but in November, and then time just got ahead of me. However, I have now finished Our Mutual Friend. I've read November's chapters as well, so hopefully the video on November's chapters, on the final chapters of Our Mutual Friend, will be going up in the next week as well, and then we will be done. I'm planning on making a video about serialised reading and my thoughts on this read-along and how it has gone, and on potential possibilities for a future Victorian-style read-along. And yeah, let's get into October's chapters. In the month of October we read from book the 4th, Chapter 8, A Few Grains of Pepper, Chapter 9, 2 Places Vacated, Chapter 10, The Doll's Dressmaker Discovers a Word, and Chapter 11, Effect is Given to the Doll's Dressmaker's Discovery. Many great chapters and even greater chapters to come for November. I hope you're all enjoying Our Mutual Friend and the very end of it. So let's get on to the chapters. So, Chapter 8, A Few Grains of Pepper, which is one of my favourite chapters because I just love Jenny Wren so very, very much. In this chapter, Jenny Wren is approached in her shop by Fascination Fledgeby, who is our kind of upper-class villain of the piece and who has led Jenny to believe that Mr. Ryer, who was a kind of surrogate father figure for her, is actually a bad man and not to be trusted, and Fledgeby therefore goes to Jenny Wren to try and persuade her of this, again to kind of reinforce his position and also to see if Jenny knows anything about where Lizzie is, because Fledgeby is trying to work out where Lizzie Hexam is, thinking that there might be money or something to gain in this. And while they are discussing, Jenny begins to suspect him, and she can't work out whether Fledgeby and Ryer are both in this kind of debt collecting business together and are both evil and are both people that she shouldn't trust, or whether one is to be trusted and one isn't, and which one that is. And she begins to doubt her previous assumption that Ryer is the bad one and Fledgeby is not. Fledgeby invites Jenny to call upon him. Fledgeby invites Jenny to call upon him. Jenny goes the next day and she finds downstairs Mrs. Lamley waiting for her husband. Mr. Lamley comes downstairs, and when Jenny goes upstairs she finds that Mr. Lamley has beaten Mr. Fledgeby and rolled him up in his own carpet, which is a very Dickensian picture of humour. Jenny is now fully convinced that Mr. Fledgeby is not a very nice man, and when Fledgeby asks her to help him bind his wounds, she puts pepper on all of his wounds to make them hurt more because she thinks he needs to be punished for his bad actions. And then at the end of the chapter she leaves to go off and find Mr. Ryer, thinking that perhaps he is a better man than she had thought. So, points of interest in this chapter. For one, it's just quite funny. I enjoyed this chapter because I find it really hilarious. Even though it's mean to imagine Mr. Fledgeby in pain, he's also a really bad person and you do feel that he deserves it. I especially like that it is Jenny, as well as Mr. Lamley, that carries out the punishment. I just think she's such an awesome character. And I think it's a great moment of her getting back at someone who has hurt her and her friend and who has pushed her apart from her friend. And also it's an instance not just of revenge for him breaking up her relationship with Mr. Ryer, but also of anger at the way he has tried to use her to get in some way to Lizzie, who Jenny cares about so much. The two people she cares about most on earth, Mr. Ryer and Lizzie, Mr. Fledgeby has tried to damage her relationship with, and this is her form of revenge. One of the things I find so interesting about Jenny is the way that she talks about the people around her and the way that everything becomes a pretense to her. Her father is never her father, he's always referred to as her child. Mr. Ryer is rarely called Mr. Ryer, he is for a lot of it fairy godmother, and after she decides that he's not a good person anymore, she refers to him as the wolf, and she refers to Fledgeby as Little Eyes. She makes everything about her a fairy tale. We know previously that she has made herself a fairy tale. Her name is not Jenny Wren, it is Fanny. I can't remember what her surname is. She changes it to Jenny Wren to make herself into a fairy tale. And so much of Our Mutual Friend, as I'll be talking about even more when I talk about November's chapters, is about pretense. It is about pretending and making stories of real life and putting a particular front into the world which is not necessarily true. And I love and I find it so fascinating how Jenny makes everything around her a fairy tale. And in the same way, Fledgeby therefore kind of gets his fairy tale villain comeuppance. Listen to the way she talks. Misty, 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 can't make it out. Little Eyes and the Wolf in a conspiracy, or Little Eyes and the Wolf against one another. Can't make it out. My poor Lizzie, have they both designs against you either way? Can't make it out. Is Little Eyes Pugsby and the Wolf Co? Can't make it out. Pugsby true to Co, or Po to Pugsby? Pugsby false to Co and Co to Pugsby? Can't make it out. What said Little Eyes? Now candidly. Ah, how the cat jumps, he's a liar. I love her, she's so odd, but I also love her strange use of language and the way that she makes everything into a fairy tale, but also she is cunning and she's clever. She is determined to work this out. I also love the scene with the Lamleys and that they kind of get their revenge on Fledgeby, because although the Lamleys are both not very nice people, Mr. Fledgeby is worse, and I do kind of feel a slight sympathy towards the Lamleys, especially towards Mrs. Lamley, because she is such an interesting, complicated character. And although I really don't like Mr. Lamley, I do feel a certain sense of satisfaction that they get some kind of revenge on Fledgeby for making their situation even worse. But what I really love here, one of my favourite passages, it's just such a great passage, is where Jenny Wren observes Mrs. Lamley smiling. She had never seen so singular a smile as that upon this lady's face. It twitched her nostrils open in a remarkable manner and contracted her lips and eyebrows. It was a smile of enjoyment too, though of such a fierce kind that Miss Wren thought she would rather not enjoy herself at all than do it in that way. I don't have that much more to say about this chapter. It's a short one, it's an enjoyable one, and I like Jenny's intelligence and the way that she works out from the Lamleys and what she vaguely knew before about Fledgeby pretending to present himself and to beg with Raya on behalf of the Lamleys, and the way the Lamleys now react to Fledgeby. Jenny begins to work things out, and therefore she punishes him. She takes it into her own mind to add pepper to his wounds in a quite awesome, though not very nice way. But Jenny, what a character, what a character. So, on to the next chapter. Chapter 9, Two Places Vacated. At the start of this chapter, Jenny goes to see Mr. Raya and says that she thinks perhaps she has been wrong about him and they have a kind of reconciliation. We discover that Raya has decided to leave his employment with Fledgeby. He doesn't really know now what to do with his life, and Jenny suggests that to start with, she may as well go back to her house with him. But on the way back, they find some men who are carrying the body of her father, and a few moments later he dies. We then see a little more of the relationship between Jenny and Mr. Raya as she begins to recover from her father's death, and as we see deep emotion in her and deep regret for what's happened and the ways in which Jenny attempts to be strong. And then at the very end of the chapter, Mortimer Lightwood appears at the doll's dressmaker's shop to announce that his friend Eugene Rayburn is on his deathbed and that he has asked for Jenny and wishes Jenny to come and see him. So much drama. Anyway, let's talk about the important things of significance in this chapter. To begin with, let me just talk a little bit again about Jenny's language and her use of fairy tale language. "And so I had given up the treacherous wolf of the forest," she replied. "But godmother, it strikes me you have come back. I am not quite sure, because the wolf and you change forms. I want to ask you a question or two to find out whether you are really godmother or really wolf. May I?" And then later about Fledgeby, "The fox has caught a famous flogging." Again, she uses this kind of fairy tale language to lighten the situation and to make life more bearable for her. Another thing I want to talk about a bit here is Mr. Raya's characterisation, and especially the way he talks about the racism that he has felt towards him, and the way that he therefore feels it makes him a more kind of responsible individual, because he feels, one, that people always will judge him more because he's Jewish, and also that people will judge other Jewish people on his standards of behaviour. He says, "I clearly reflected for the first time, that in bending my neck to the yoke I was willing to wear, I bent the unwilling necks of the whole Jewish people. For it is not in Christian countries with the Jews as with other people. Men say that is a bad Greek, but there are good Greeks. This is a bad Turk, but there are good Turks. Not so with the Jews. Men find out the bad among us easily enough. Among what people are the bad not easily found, but they take the worst of us as samples of the best. They take the lowest of us as presentations of the highest, and say all Jews are alike. If doing what I was content to do here, because I was grateful for the past and have small need of money now, I had been a Christian, I could have done it compromising no one but my individual self. But doing it as a Jew, I could not choose but compromise the Jews of all conditions and all countries. It is hard upon us, but it is the truth." This is a really interesting passage, because on the one hand what Dickens is doing is criticising persecution and racism and the way that many people perceive Jewish people within the Victorian period, but also he does seem to condone Raya's idea that Raya must have some kind of moral responsibility for everyone who is Jewish, that he must be as moral as possible because otherwise people will judge other people, and that therefore he should be kept always to a higher moral standard than other people, which is interesting and very complicated. And he also points out that even in Jenny, who is his greatest friend, one of the reasons why Jenny believed so quickly that he might be evil is to do with the fact that he's Jewish, and how bad this is. Even Jenny, who cared about him so much, also had those kind of Victorian stereotypes and prejudices ingrained in her. Nonetheless, Raya has now given up his post and no longer works for Fledgeby. Raya is such an interesting character because on the one hand, Dickens presents him as this kind of saintly figure, this person who is so utterly and often inhumanly good, but at the same time, for a lot of the book, he works for a very bad man who he knows is bad. On the one hand, he kind of acts as one of Dickens's male angel figures, which he does have a few of, for example, Tom Pinch in Martin Chuzzlewit, but at the same time, his character is more complicated by the fact that he works for Fledgeby, this bad person, and does his bidding for him until this point. And at this point, the reason why he leaves is not just because he feels that he might have been doing wrong in working for this man. He's leaving because he doesn't want people to think that all Jewish people are immoral, rather than because he thinks what he's been doing is immoral, if you see what I mean. It's very complicated, but anyway, certainly an interesting thing to think about. Next, I want to talk a little bit about Jenny's reaction to her father's death. It's significant, I think, that even after her father's death, she continues to refer to him as her child. She says, "Oh yes, dear gentleman, he's my child, out without leave, my poor bad boy, and he doesn't know me, he doesn't know me. Oh, what shall I do when my own child doesn't know me?" She calls him my poor unfortunate child and says, "I felt my responsibility as a mother so much." Again, she keeps up this kind of pretense and she reverses the relationship between them to make it her fault that he is bad rather than his fault that she has led a bad life. There is one moment, I think, when you get a sense of Jenny's real age and Jenny's real relationship to her father, and it's when she says, "I must have a very short cry, godmother, before I cheer up, because after all, a child is a child, you know." It was a longer cry than might have been expected. On the surface, she's referring to her father, who she always calls her child, but actually she's also referring to herself and saying, "I have to cry because I'm a child and this is awful." And I think that's really, really important, and you do see moments of real emotion and real sense of actually what's going on, that Jenny, for all her fairy tale pretense, does understand the gravities of the situations around her and does feel them very, very deeply, and that the fairy tale language she uses is a coping mechanism. I think that's all I have to say about that chapter. We end with Mortimer coming to see Jenny Wren, saying that Eugene has asked for her, and we end with Jenny leaving to go and see Eugene, which leads us on to the next chapter, chapter 10, The Doll's Dressmaker Discovers a Word. I love this chapter very, very much. It makes me very happy, and I think it's really, really interesting. Saying that, it's a short one and not much happens. Basically, Eugene is incredibly ill, incredibly injured, in bed, possibly about to die, no one really knows. Jenny arrives and comes to see him and comes to help nurse him, along with Mortimer and also Lizzie, who is there whenever she is off work. We get a sense in this chapter of a kind of moral transformation of Eugene. He is putting Lizzie's needs a little more before his own, and he begs Mortimer not to prosecute Bradley Headstone because he believes that if Bradley Headstone is prosecuted, Lizzie's name will be dragged into the press and it will do damage to her reputation and to her life. And then at the end of the chapter, he asks Jenny and Mortimer if they will ask Lizzie if she will marry him because he wishes to marry Lizzie before he dies. So, points of interest in this chapter, because it is one I really, really enjoy. The character relationships within this chapter are really, really interesting. To begin with, the character relationship between Mortimer and Eugene, and we get such a sense of their strong love and the bond between them in this chapter. It says that Lightwood never left him. He is always at his side, he is always there, he always wants the best for him, and he's always there to try and help his friend. I think the relationship between Jenny and Eugene is really interesting in this chapter too, because you get a sense in this chapter that there is a sudden and important and significant bond between them, where previously there had at times been a kind of antagonistic relationship. Jenny didn't always trust him, but now, partly because he is physically weakened and therefore his kind of power, in a sense, has been taken away, Jenny is no longer afraid of him, no longer mistrustful of him. And it's partly, as I said, to do with the power, but I think it's also partly to do with the fact that he is physically injured. Eugene talks to her about this vision of children and flowers that she had talked about having previously, and she spoke about having it when she was in great pain. This is her vision that she said of children and flowers that would take her away and help her in her mind when she had pain, and he brings them up now because he is in great physical pain and he has the same kind of ideas, and suddenly there is a kind of greater understanding between them because he is now in the kind of great physical pain that she has experienced quite often in her life. That means that he understands her more and she also in a way understands him more, and so they have this kind of new bond between them, which I think is quite interesting and quite important. It's very significant that it is Jenny Wren and that it is the doll's dressmaker that discovers the word that suggests to Mortimer that the word Eugene is struggling to say is wife, that he is trying to say that he would like to marry Lizzie. It's Jenny in this moment who completely understands him suddenly. One, because she's just like really, really clever and really cool, but also because there is this new kind of bond between them to do with his illness and to do with the fact that she now sees, I think, more than ever that he loves Lizzie and that there can be more between them than Lizzie needing to fly from him. And this is also, I think, to do with Eugene's kind of moral transformation. And this is really, really interesting because Eugene before has been a man of careless and sometimes dishonourable intentions. We get the impression that he doesn't really want to ruin Lizzie, but he also kind of does. In the next chapter, Bradley Headstone kind of is aware that if this attack had never happened, if Eugene had not been injured in this way, the marriage would have never happened because Eugene wouldn't have had this kind of moral transformation. But he realises now that his intentions towards Lizzie have not always been right. He realises, partly I think, that Lizzie had removed herself from London, from him and from the situation to do with Bradley Headstone, and also he realises that Lizzie is a little bit more than he thought her. He did care about her deeply before this point, but because she has saved his life and he has seen that she is even more than he thought, this also affects his relationship towards her. He says to Mortimer, "I have wronged her enough in fact, I have wronged her still more in intention." And at this point Eugene realises what he has done and what he has meant and how his behaviour towards her could have damaged Lizzie, and therefore he wants to kind of make a reparation but also to fix himself before he dies, to make himself a better man, the kind of man he could have been. And so he asks Lizzie if she will marry him. "Shield her. The guilty man brought to justice would poison her name. Let the guilty man go unpunished. Lizzie and my reparation before all." He mutters Lizzie's name in his sleep. All he can think about is marrying her before he dies. He's bored and he is in pain, but also he has this decision in a way that Eugene Wrayburn does not normally have. And it's significant that this is as much a matter of honour as a matter of love. Mortimer says to him, "Your mind will be more at peace lying here if you make Lizzie your wife. You wish me to speak to her and tell her so and entreat her to be your wife. You ask her to kneel at this bedside and be married to you that your reparation may be complete." It is a matter of honour and of fixing the situation in which he has played a bad part as much as it is a matter of love, and this is important. Although we do see in this chapter and in the next how dearly he does love her and how much their relationship means to him. He says to Mortimer, "If my dear brave girl will take me, I feel persuaded that I shall live long enough to be married." And I really like that description. I like that he says "my dear brave girl" because it emphasises so importantly what he loves about Lizzie, that it is her bravery and it is her strength of character, because in a lot of Dickens books the way men refer to women they're about to be married to is all about beauty and sweetness, but this is not. This is about bravery, and I really like that. I think it's really, really important and it's nice. I think Eugene is a complicated and problematic figure at times, but I also think you get a sense of his real love for Lizzie underneath it all in this chapter. Which leads me on nicely to the next chapter. Effect is given to the doll's dressmaker's discovery. This chapter begins with Bella. Bella is at home when Mr. Lightwood comes to call. He says that his friend Eugene Wrayburn is on his deathbed. He is about to be married to Lizzie. Lizzie has asked if Bella will come down for the wedding and come down to be present, so Mortimer has come to Bella's house to fetch her and her husband to come down for the wedding. But when her husband John comes in, John says that he will not go to the wedding and that he cannot see Mr. Lightwood, and he refuses to explain why. We know why. It's because he previously met Mortimer when he was pretending to be Julius Hanford, and that Mortimer will suspect him quite severely for being a suspicious person in the Harmon case. But he does not tell Bella, and Bella accepts that he doesn't tell her in a way that troubles me, but more on that I think when I talk about November's chapters. And then Bella goes alone to the wedding with Mr. Lightwood. On their way to the wedding, they pick up the Milvies, the clergyman couple who are coming to marry Eugene and Lizzie. And while at the station, Mr. Milvey meets Bradley Headstone, and Bradley finds out that Eugene and Lizzie are going to be married. He realises that if he had not attacked Eugene in this way, this probably would have never happened, because Eugene probably wouldn't have decided to marry Lizzie, and this stresses him beyond measure, and he has a fit at the railway station. Later in the chapter we find ourselves at Eugene's bedside. Eugene and Lizzie are married, and we have a conversation between Eugene and Lizzie about whether or not Eugene is going to survive and about their possible future together. Eugene ends the chapter by saying that he doesn't think he is worthy of Lizzie, that he is worried that if he lives, she will find this out, and that perhaps the best thing he can do is to die. So, many interesting things to talk about in this chapter. First, let's talk about John and Bella. I think it's really interesting that after her marriage, Bella is very often referred to as Mrs. Rokesmith, Mrs. John, or Mrs. John Rokesmith, because John Rokesmith is not a person, he does not exist, because he is a pretense. He's actually John Harmon, and therefore Mrs. John Rokesmith is not a person either. By often referring to her as Mrs. John or Mrs. John Rokesmith rather than Bella, it kind of takes away her identity, because she goes from being her previous self to a person who does not quite exist, who is, like her husband John Rokesmith, a pretense. And then I also think the relationship between her and John is so interesting in this chapter, because John refuses to see Mr. Lightwood, refuses to go to the wedding, and will absolutely not tell her why. And she kind of goes along with it. And what I think is interesting here is that we have another kind of pretense. She lightens the situation with her language. She says, "I am half angry with you, John dear, and half pleased with you, because you are such a stupid old fellow, and yet you say just nice things as if you mean them. Don't be mysterious, sir. What harm do you know of Mr. Lightwood?" She says everything in a kind of light manner in order to lessen the gravity of the situation. She says a married sphinx isn't a nice confidential husband. She calls her husband Bluebeard. She lightens things by referring to fairy tales and myths, because the truth of the matter is quite a serious one, that her husband has a lot of secrets that he hasn't told her yet, and which she says that she will accept because she still feels that she has to prove herself morally to her husband, because she feels that she has been a bad person in the past and she is trying to make some kind of reparation for that. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the Bradley Headstone scene at the railway station. This is quite interesting because it's the first time in ages that we've seen Bradley Headstone from a perspective of someone who doesn't know what's going on. Usually we only see him from his own perspective or from Riderhood's, and to see him now from Mr. Milby's perspective, who thinks he's just a respectable man who's overworked and not very well, is very interesting and quite sad, I think, because they don't know the torment that's going on inside him. He appears to the railway staff and to Frank Milby as a man of a very respectable occupation who had said he was out of health, as his appearance would of itself have indicated. He looks like a respectable man who's not very well, whereas actually we know, and he knows, that he is a criminal, that his respectability is a facade, and that he is in deep emotional and mental torment. But I think it's really interesting to look at the way Milby describes him. He seemed to be a shy man, struggling against nervousness, and spoke in a very constrained way. The moment he hears of Lizzie and Eugene's wedding, he turns faint and has a fit. His emotional and mental strain is embodied in his physical reaction. And finally, I want to talk about that last conversation between Eugene and Lizzie, which ends this chapter, because I think it's so lovely. It's such a moment of great emotion. It's such a poignant moment of such happiness and sadness, because they are both really glad and happy to have been married, but also under such circumstances where neither of them really know whether or not Eugene's going to live. So I'm just going to read a bit of their conversation that I really enjoy. "I bless the day," said Eugene. "I bless the day," said Lizzie. "You have made a poor marriage of it, my sweet wife," said Eugene. "A shattered, graceless fellow, stretched at his length here, and next to nothing for you when you are a young widow." "I have made the marriage I would have given all the world to dare to hope for," she replied. "You have thrown yourself away," said Eugene, shaking his head. But you have followed the treasure of your heart. My justification is that you had thrown that away first, dear girl. No, I had given it to you. The same thing, my poor Lizzie. Hush, hush, a very different thing." There were tears in his eyes, and she besought him to close them. "No," said Eugene, again shaking his head. "Let me look at you, Lizzie, while I still can. You brave, devoted girl, you heroine." I really like that line, especially I like that he says, "you heroine," because for me, Lizzie is like the ultimate Dickensian heroine. She's the ultimate heroine, and she is my favourite, I think, of his heroines. Jenny Wren is possibly my favourite, like, young female character in Dickens, but I don't think Jenny Wren is the heroine of this book. I think Bella, and to a greater extent, Lizzie, are the heroines of this book. Lizzie's very interesting because she has what most of the very early Dickensian heroines have. She has beauty and sweetness and kindness and devotion, but then she also has what the later Dickensian heroines have, like Esther in Bleak House or Amy and Little Dorrit. She has sense and abilities, but then she also has what is kind of unique to herself. She has such emotional strength and also such physical strength. She saves a man's life. Like, that's not the kind of thing that Dickensian heroines normally do, and that's why I think she's so important and significant a character, and why she is so interesting, and why she gets rewarded, though in a kind of bitter way, by being able to marry the man that she loves, even though he is on his deathbed. And I think the way this chapter ends is really interesting as well, because we get a sense of Eugene, this man who has been careless and selfish all his life, finally realising that he has been a bad person for a lot of his life, that he has been careless and selfish, that he has put Lizzie's respectability in danger, that he has negatively affected many aspects of Lizzie's life, and he begins to realise that he could have been, and that he hopes he could be if he lives, a better person, but that he fears he would not. He says, "Well, if I live, you'll find me out. I shall find out that my husband has a mind of purpose and energy and will turn it to the best account. I hope so, dearest Lizzie. I hope so, but I can't summon the vanity to think so. How can I think so, looking back on such a trifling, wasted youth as mine? I humbly hope it, but I daren't believe it. There is a sharp misgiving in my conscience that if I were to live, I should disappoint your good opinion and my own, and that I ought to die, my dear." Such an interesting character, I think, and you get such a strong sense in this chapter of the love between them, but also how Eugene is kind of aware that he isn't quite good enough for this almost angelic figure as Lizzie does appear in this book. For example, if you think of the moment where Betty Higden awakes to Lizzie being there and thinks that she's died and that Lizzie is an angel, and she is presented in this way throughout quite a lot of this book. She's not exactly an angel in the house, is she? Because angel in the houses wouldn't go saving people's lives and wouldn't go rowing boats or working in a paper mill, but she is this kind of angelic figure of great courage and goodness and awesomeness, to be honest. And it's interesting that Eugene as a character has to go through this great physical pain, has to go through this near-death experience, has to get near to death before he realises, one, that he has perhaps been a bad person, but also before he realises Lizzie's true worth and realises his own worthlessness to a certain extent. I like Eugene a lot. I think he's such an interesting, fascinating character, and I think the complexities of his relationship with Lizzie really bring that home and really reinforce the interestingness and the intricacies of both of their characters. I love this plot within Our Mutual Friend. I think it's such a brilliant, brilliant love story between them, and I love this chapter very, very much. So I think that's all I have to say about this chapter. I hope you have enjoyed October's chapters of Our Mutual Friend and this video. I'm very excited to talk about the final 6 chapters of this book in the next video. In the final video in the serialised read-along of Our Mutual Friend, I will be talking about the last 6 chapters of the book. Chapter 12, The Passing Shadow. Chapter 13, Showing How the Golden Dustman Helped to Scatter Dust. Chapter 14, Checkmate to the Friendly Move. Chapter 15, What Was Caught in the Traps That Was Set. Chapter 16, Persons and Things in General. And chapter the last, The Voice of Society. I am so excited to talk about the end of this book. I love this book so much, as you may have guessed by now. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.